I hadn't seen the papers until a few minutes before, so I just want to assure everyone and Marcus this isn't a setup. Because Marcus Spiller has been very kind enough to join us tonight, and you can see the SGS logo because he's actually come up here from Melbourne to join us specially, and I consider that to be a very, very gracious and generous sponsorship in a sense. But Dr. Marcus Spiller is a principal and partner and director of SGS Economics and Planning. He's one of the S's. And his consulting experience really goes through land economics, regional development, housing policy, infrastructure funding and policy. But I guess at the base of that is a profound understanding of economics. He's worked with local and state governments for the Commonwealth. He's an adjunct professor in urban management at the University of Canberra. He's a former member of the National Housing and Supply Council and a former national president of the Planning Institute of Australia. But as a leading practitioner of economics, the so-called dismal science, Marcus is anything but. And I think it's fair to say he certainly sees economics far more broadly than that mechanistic view of the world that in fact gave economics that moniker of being the dismal science in the first place. So Marcus is not a setup, but it's to do with, part of the aim of tonight was to recognise that there are these technical formal procedures which determine what projects progress forward. And I think I won't repeat what Philip's just said, but this, I think we'd all agree, is something that we need to talk about more openly. And so thank you very much, Marcus, for not sticking your neck out, but...
So I was going to start with a joke about the economist, the planner and the architect sitting in the bar discussing how they're going to pick the winner of the Melbourne Cup, but I've been warned off that. So, so we might play a silly game instead. And I'll ask you to contemplate a scenario where one of these three professions, economics, planning and architecture, this is a silly game, so bear with me, but just imagine a scenario where one of those disciplines takes charge of the Bays precinct, the future of the Bays precinct, and calls the shots. What I'd like you to do is put your hand up if you think the economists should be entrusted with that task. There's got to be one. I don't think I need to proceed much further with this. I was going to ask how many would put their hands up for the architects? Oh, yes. And the planners? Oh, mostly planners. Dear, oh dear. So, look, I think that is a kind of a good intro to what I have to argue tonight, and that is that economics is typically seen as the enemy in terms of progressing a better city. It's often construed, the discipline is often construed by those in the community sector, or more broadly, those aligned with what I would call, generally the green movement, as being lacking in imagination and focused purely on the commerciality of projects. In truth, however, effective application of economic theory and tools is likely to be a critical element in the prosecution of a genuine community vision for these kinds of areas. Indeed, I would say that without a degree of mastery of these ideas, a progressive agenda for places like the Bays precinct is likely to be easy prey for those with a far less imaginative vision. It's true, as Philip has argued, that economics aspires to express everything of value in dollar terms. And I know that this is unpalatable and downright offensive to some. Many of us, or many would have us resist tarnishing our lofty ideals with such crass mercantile ideas. But I too am a devotee of Gough. He gave me 3 free degrees. But as Gough said, it is only the pure who are truly impotent. I can't do his voice, but I think that was... You have to engage with this discipline in order to advance the agenda. But in any case, it is really quite unfair to economists to portray them in this mould. If you look back at the history of economics, it is a discipline that perhaps is the equal of planning and is the equal of architecture, and in some senses perhaps shading those disciplines, because its original mandate was to make life better. Its original mandate and its continuing mandate is about custody of the community's resources and getting the best possible value from those resources. So if we're looking at a mega project like the Bays Precinct, which I've sort of made my case study here, not that I know too much about the site, you've got to forgive me, I'm from Melbourne, but the economists would construe the public policy problem in terms of this generic equation. I don't know if it's showing fully on your screen there, but effectively the economists would look at, as has been asserted already, would look at the traded costs and benefits. How much are people willing to pay for housing there? How much are people willing to pay to conduct their business there? How much are people willing to pay to set up shops there? Because these things reflect the drawing power of the location and the enjoyment that people get from visiting there or living there. But in addition, and most importantly, we are compelled by the discipline of economics to take into account non-traded effects, the so-called externalities, things that are outside of the market, which are valued by people but are not traded. And from that benefit side of the equation, we take off the costs of the resources that we are expending in order to gain those benefits, and those costs are typically land, labour and capital, but let's not forget that capital embraces environmental capital as well. And we need to take into account the detriment that we cause of all sorts: pollution, noise, construction nuisance, emissions, etc. So what we're looking for as an economist is to optimise that net community benefit. It's not just about commercial exchanges, it's about coming to grips with all things that are of value to the community. Now, as bizarre as it might seem to many sceptics, most non-traded effects of projects, or most non-traded benefits and costs of projects, are in fact capable of monetisation in a sensible way. Now, I might just point out here that it's not so much about the value, the number that you put on things, it's more about the set of thinking rules that you must adhere to when identifying those benefits or costs and then ascribing a value. It sets up a transparent and accountable discussion framework. You can't get away without being explicit about your method. You're accountable for it, which is something, I think, of value in the discipline generally. But I've just thrown up here a few things that come up from time to time in cost-benefit analyses of mega projects, where at first glance you might think, how could you possibly put a value on that? Well, there are techniques that have been developed. They are transparent, they are debatable, they can be challenged in the academic literature, they can be peer-reviewed, and over time we've developed a view about them. So, for example, open space. How do you value open space? A park. Surely this is the people's domain. it has intrinsic value. It's pointless to even think about putting a commercial value on it. Well, you can put a value on it if you regard it in terms of what people are prepared to give up in order to go down and enjoy the park. If they're going to hop on a bus or hop on their bike and spend half an hour to get down to the park, and then they're going to spend an hour down in the park and then half an hour travelling back, they've given up 2 hours of their time. They could have spent that 2 hours doing something else. That 2 hours has an opportunity cost. Over time, we've kind of worked out a consensus that maybe $11 an hour is the opportunity cost of leisure time. So that trip to the park costs $22. If we can figure out how many visits are made to the park per year, we can put a value on the park. And at SGS, we did put a value on a park at a place called the Abbotsford Convent in Melbourne. If you haven't seen the Abbotsford Convent, when you're down there next, have a look. But putting that value on that park saved the Abbotsford Convent from crass residential development to a permanent community resource. So economics saved the day on that occasion. Social capital is another one where you might think instinctively it's not capable of being valued. Well, if you're happy to accept the argument that social capital is reflected in the willingness of people to put their own time into working with, assisting, developing their local community, i.e. volunteerism, you can calculate the number of volunteer hours and put a value on it. What's wrong with that as a way of measuring something that's of importance to us? Urban amenity. Valuers do this all the time. They look at the uplift in land value contingent upon the transformation or the investment in the public domain in an area. Helen put up many examples of that where you do get an uplift. Why do you get an uplift? You get more people coming to visit, you get more footfall, you get more turnover in the shops, rents go up. If rents go up, property values go up. And if you're really pressed on things like heritage and culture, you can do contingency valuation surveys. You can actually ask people what they're willing to pay to get a certain outcome. Now that's a little, I have to say, a little more problematic because you're asking people what they would do rather than observing what they do, which is the approach you apply to the other three. But these techniques have been used to put a value on reinstating biodiversity in the Murray River, retaining old growth forests in Tasmania, investing in major new cultural facilities, etc. So there are ways of putting values on things that you might think are beyond the reach of such monetisation. But of course, not everything of value is readily capable of being measured and monetised, and there is a role for non-negotiables. The people can say certain things are not for sale. We're not prepared to trade at all. They could relate to things like our design standards, if we could somehow define that. It could relate to things like access to the foreshore. Philip's comment about Barangaroo. It's a disgrace that you give up the people's access to the people's land. Avoiding overshadowing of key public domain or key public buildings. And I would, and this is where you do get into the domain of politics and values, I would say that social mix and social inclusion should be a non-negotiable in these projects. So, if it's as clear and as simple as I'm putting it to you, that you can measure a lot of things and you can set your non-negotiables, what's wrong? Why hasn't economics gained the faith and trust of its partner disciplines and indeed played a more influential role in public policy? Well, a number of things have gone wrong. One is that we have misaligned governments, and I think one of the key issues that's coming out for me tonight, the fundamental problem is that we have no voice for the metropolis. So the state government the state government makes a lot of decisions about these mega projects, but the state government is not competent to make those decisions. When I say it's not competent, I'm not meaning that it lacks intelligence or skills or advice. I'm saying it has no mandate from the constituency that is the metropolis. It doesn't stand for the city, in other words. It stands for New South Wales. So it doesn't stand for the city in the same way that Boris Johnson or Ken Livingstone stood for London. So we have a democratic deficit that I and others have written about. By the way, local government doesn't stand for the metropolis either. It only stands for parts of the metropolis. So we've got a misalignment of government, but beyond that, or probably secondary to that, we have a cash-strapped government, and Philip correctly raises the point. How can we have a cash-strapped government in one of the richest countries in the world that's been rich since forever? Well, one of the tragedies of our democracy is that the Commonwealth collects all the taxes, more than 80%. If you compare our tax regime with that of the US, we have roughly the same tax take. About a quarter of GDP is taken in tax in the US and Australia, and we are, as Philip has pointed out, down the bottom end of the spectrum of OECD countries when it comes to global tax take. But in the US, the federal government takes less than 40% of all taxes. The other taxes are collected by states, cities and local counties. There's much more discretion at the local level about the amount and types of taxes. So a lot of the tools that Helen talked about are just not available to us here because this monster Commonwealth government has really crowded out the states and indeed any other sphere of government in terms of tools to mould the city. And whilst I'm a huge admirer of Gough Whitlam, it is true, it is sad to say, but it is true that Labor governments in Canberra tend to be the most centralist. They suck in power every time. And I just hope that the current invitation to have a grown-up discussion about vertical fiscal imbalance is in fact taken seriously, because I think it could be a game changer on this front. But in terms of the cash-strapped government, it really does skew decision-making enormously. It means that when governments look at a place like Barangaroo or the Bays Precinct or Docklands or whatever, it's not economic analysis that they are guided by, it's financial analysis. And don't ever confuse the two, because financial analysis is just about the traded side of the equation, not the externalities. I think also the community disempowers itself, partly because it doesn't have the institutions, the representation, the forums to engage with this, if you like, for want of a better way of putting it, economic perspective on the future of these precincts. Rather, the community tends to want to differentiate itself, reject that approach, because it's the enemy. And I think that very sadly undermines the agenda. Our governance structures blind us. That's repeating really what I said earlier. That is, we don't actually have governance structures that look at the city as an entity, as a constituency. We do at an intellectual level, but as a democratic forum, the state government does not stand for the city and is blind to many of the issues that the city has to deal with. And finally, notwithstanding what I said earlier, the evidence base is lacking on some things. Now, I was astounded about a year ago when we did some work for the City of Melbourne about their housing policy, and we just assumed at SGS that social mix is a valued thing and that there would be evidence in the literature that demonstrated that if you have diverse and inclusive communities, everybody is better off in terms of their social outcomes, health, employment, etc. And it's not just the disadvantaged people. Now, we just thought Ahuri could just do the literature search for us, go off and pull together the evidence, and that would be that part of the job done. Ahuri found no compelling evidence. All the literature is focused on saving, all of the literature is about avoiding concentrated disadvantage. But the wider benefit of diverse and inclusive communities, there wasn't a lot of evidence. So that was one of those areas where you're thrown back onto your values, I suppose, and your non-negotiables. Now, I'm pleased to say that the City of Melbourne said, well, look, we don't care if there's no evidence, we want inclusion, so that was good. So just to finish up, in terms of a way forward in this thing, trying to broker a little bit of a partnership between the planners and the architects and the economists, a number of things I think need to be addressed. One is to really rethink governance, and that's a major structural reform that we're going to struggle with for a long time, but I do think it's the threshold issue. And by aligning decision-making institutions, I'm talking about some form of democratic forum that takes custody of the metropolis. Not instead of local governments. Local governments would still do their local stuff, but a metropolitan government to look after the metropolitan level things, including sites of metropolitan significance. Now, it's very interesting, just thinking back on Helen's presentation, that London drifted during the 80s, during the years after Thatcher sacked the GLA. Tony Blair brought back the Greater London Council, or the other way around. I always get my GLCs and GLAs mixed up. Even though he knew it would cause a political nightmare for him, a thorn in his side. And London has never looked back since the reinstatement of that Metropolitan Forum. I think a lot of the sustainability initiatives, a lot of the quality planning and delivery of major projects can be traced back to the reinstatement of that forum. We've really got to think about ways of moving towards that in this country. In the meantime, we should have appropriate stakeholder representation for places like the Bays Precinct. We need to take a long-term view, and we need to establish the base case. By the base case, and I omitted to sort of discuss this earlier, in cost-benefit analysis, you're not talking absolutes, you're talking about margins from what would happen if you did nothing. So we've got to understand what would happen in the Bays Precinct if you did nothing or you took a passive approach. The non-negotiables need to be agreed. And at some point you need to have some kind of reasonable financial profile. What are you expecting the project to do in terms of financial returns? Okay, you're going to optimise community welfare to the best you can, but you know, there is a real world. Governments do have to generate some cash from these places, or may reasonably generate some cash. What kind of expectation are we going to put on it? We need to take a holistic economic perspective and apply rigorous cost-benefit analysis. I think rigorous cost-benefit analysis can sharpen up everybody's thinking. It may not give the right quantitative answers, but at least it's a transparent way of debating the pros and cons. We need to align procurement models with the planning vision. I think one of the great things that we've all learnt from Rod, and I sincerely thank him for this, is that you just don't carve these places up into huge chunks and hand them over to monopoly developers who can hold the community to ransom thereafter. So we've really got to think about more disaggregated, diverse ways of delivering these projects. And we also need to think about governance for procurement and transition. And by that I mean thinking about ways in which these places can be drawn back into the host community for management and governance participation in the long term. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward to questions and panel discussion if there's time. Thank you.